really delighted. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you, Minister Stephen. Thank you, dear Andrea, for organizing this discussion just before the venue of the G7 meeting, which is planned at a very critical time for the world. This is the first G7 summit in 2 years' time because of the pandemic. And we all know how special, how devastating were 2020 and 2021 on our health and the consequences of COVID-19 on our social organization, our economies, and our freedom and even our democracies. And I can tell you that as Labour International, we have witnessed during 2020 many human rights violations everywhere in the world. Human rights violation has increasingly risen, and authoritarian regimes has used the crisis to oppress people, to restrict freedom and liberties, threatening the principles of democracies and of human rights. This year, UK is taking on the presidency of the G7 and is also preparing to host the COP26 UN Climate Conference in November. And so UK has a historical responsibility as president in leading the G7 members to build back better, as they say, through an inclusive recovery plan where nobody is left behind. And this is happening in a time where inequalities are dramatically increasing and where new inequalities are born, and I'm thinking to digital inequalities, digital lack of infrastructure, digital illiteracy. But let me tell you, I was really relieved when I read the concept note of the G7 meeting, and when I read the objective of this G7 meeting planned in June, and also when I read the communique of the G7 Ministers of Finance, which happened in May, I was happy to see that the country of the Commonwealth is immensely committed to champion liberal values and to uphold democracy, champion rights, and protect world's most vulnerable. UK affirms that liberal democracy and free and fair market remain the best models for inclusive, sustainable social and economic advancement, and has committed to build back better from COVID-19 and create a greener, more prosperous future for all of us. This is also the first time I have written that the interlink between climate, biodiversity, health, development, conflict, migration, and security is recognized very, very clearly, and that's an amazing achievement. This is also very optimistic to see that solidarity is in the core of the G7 meeting, and our principles of nobody is safe until all of us are safe is guiding the G7 strategy to support the most vulnerable to access to the vaccine. And you will recall that in February 2021, liberals were again ahead of the curve when, together with the Parliamentarian Assembly of the Council of Europe, President Rick Dems and myself called for a fairer and faster vaccine rollout globally. And we know until now that with more than I would say 600 million vaccine doses administered worldwide, which is equal to rather 8 doses for every 100 people, there is already a stark gap between vaccination program in different countries with many yet to report a single dose. So UK has committed also to fulfill the promises of the Paris Agreement to support vulnerable countries and the developing world, to support them to adapt themselves to climate change and to prevent climate crises and climate disasters. Even if I have a regret, I would say, I really regret that the commitment of the financial support of the $100 billion, which was planned to be implemented by 2020, was postponed by the G7 Ministers of Finance to 2025. But I'm still optimistic because I see that there's the strategy which was set and the trajectory is very optimistic, and there is a real political will to implement the global transformation called for by the Paris Agreement. So I wish UK will be able to make COP26 a COP of climate justice, a COP of bridging the North and the South, a COP of cooperation for a greener world, simply a COP of actions and concrete actions, because we need to act right now. Let's recall that we are in a critical situation with only 8 or 9 years left to avoid the irreversible, according to the IPCC and to the Climate Action Tracker. So we are in a very critical situation, and we are right now witnessing an increase of CO2 emissions since 2015. So I would say that there are some critical factors to be dealt with in the G7 and Glasgow meeting during COP26. COP26 must deliver a feasible and concrete roadmap to reverse the actual situation and to begin as soon as possible to decrease the curve of CO2 emissions if we want to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. And this is only possible if the indices, coupled with the ratchet up mechanism, which are I would say the backbone of the agreement and of its upward dynamic. If this is only possible if the indices are ambitious, and that means that the level of political will and of perseverance of states need to be increased too. Also, I will add that Glasgow needs to deliver on building a new kind of indices. Indices must be put into a positive pressure by the mobilization of the non-state actors, by the mobilization of territorial actors, and I was particularly and proud to see that the Marrakesh Partnership was, which I launched during COP22, together with Laurence Tubiana, was considered by the G7 Ministers of Finance beyond the appropriate platforms to gather all the actors and to build sustainable project and resilient project. The second point is that COP26 should definitely close the discussion about the target, the 1.5 degrees C. 1.5 degrees C, which was concluded by the IPCC report in 2018, should be the compass for the trajectory in terms of ambitions. We have already negotiated the Paris Agreement. There is no negotiation. This is a COP of implementation. So this objective should be the objective of all the countries to reach the carbon neutrality. Third point is that COP26 must deliver on a robust proposal for carbon price and carbon market globally. And I'm thinking about this Article 6 of negotiation, which must be a success during COP26, because let's remind that the EU may implement its border carbon tax, and that could trigger new trade tensions that in turn will degrade prospects for climate negotiations. So finally, I will say that we need to foster a change among 7 billion humans. That can only be possible, and that can only be done at a very local level and with local access to facilitated finance. COP26 must correct our global driving approach to a more effective local action. Concerning the G7 meeting, the challenges, in my opinion, will be to foster international cooperation. And I will begin by especially to speed up the access to the vaccine to allow the world to recover globally. And the second challenge will be to rehabilitate multilateralism and to consolidate multilateralism in order to set a new world order based on rule of law, on human rights respect, and to launch a Marshall Plan to phase out coal, finance carbon sequestration, and innovation. I'm ending now, and I would like to salute the EU strategy and efforts which put as conditions to any funding or cooperation two conditions: democracy and green policies, and that is game-changing. In Liberal International, we have been working hard, providing guidance to Liberal International member parties, increasing their capacity to allow them to be active contributors to the global construction of real democracies, sustainable, green, inclusive, and fair countries. We have called on our parties to embrace the opportunities of this devastating health crisis from within, opportunities to foster cooperation for a better shared future, opportunities to reduce inequalities, to foster within the recovery plan the low carbon investment needed to reach the global transformation and the SDGs, opportunities to build a solid ethical digital infrastructure and to rebuild the educational system to allow our children to have the right skills and to adapt themselves to the new generation of jobs. I will end by saying that UK is historically known for its leadership in setting liberal values. UK is also known for its diplomatic capacity. During the G7 summit, all eyes will be on the 7 countries which have the ambition to pull the rest of the world forward with them. The result of the G7 summit must be ambitious if we want the rest of the world to follow. We have a historic opportunity to reverse the damage done with minimal consequences, but we need the G7 countries to be bold in setting a pathway for change. So, finally, I strongly believe that human beings have the creativity, vision, and courage to move within this challenging world, both ethically and with respect to human rights, to build a greener, sustainable, but human world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hakima. That was very inspiring, and I think many of us would have got a lot from what you have said there. Thank you very much. We will now continue with our webinar, and what I'm going to do now is introduce you to the 3 panelists that we have today. The 3 panelists are, first one is Martin Hodgstick. He is a Slovak activist, an environmental expert, and a politician elected to the European member of the European Parliament since 2019. In addition to his committee's assignments, Martin is a member of the European Parliament Intergroup on Welfare and Conservation of Animals, and a member of the political group Renew Europe. He is also the vice chair of the non-parliamentary political movement Progressive Slovakia, and their experts on environmental issues and sustainability. With us today, we also have Catherine Walsh, she is from Gibraltar. She's one of the most senior members of the policy team in the Department of the Environment, Sustainability, Climate Change and Heritage in Gibraltar. Catherine is an associate member of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment with over 10 years of experience. Catherine provides policy advice and support across a wide range of areas, from air quality to waste through to renewable energy and climate change. And last but definitely not least is Njeri, is a former executive director of Greenpeace Africa. She completed her contract in the 31st of August 2019. Prior to that, to this, Njeri worked as an executive director at the Center of the Multi-Party Democracy in Kenya for 11 years. She also worked for 7 years for the Amnesty International as the development coordinator for East and Southern Africa. Since February 2021, Njeri is serving as the chair of the Board of Advisors of International IDEA Stockholm. She is on the board of Inter-Transformation Initiatives in Pretoria and the Board of Democracy Works in Pretoria and the Board of Democracy Trust Fund in Nairobi. She has served as a board of Kenya Human Rights Commission for 12 years. This is a very, very good panel, I think. It's very extensive. It covers most of the areas. And I will now ask one question to the three panelists. And you have 5 minutes to answer the questions. And the question is, how did this pandemic impact the climate change agenda? We will be starting with Martin. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for the invitation and the possibility to speak at this webinar. I'm very happy that what I would call the green recovery agenda is spreading around the world, and Liberal International is taking it up. And this is, for me, the key thing that the pandemic influenced, and that's the green recovery. Back in the day when the pandemic has really started to reach global proportions, it was actually the Liberal group in the European Parliament that started the call for the green recovery. I think this is very important to realize that when we faced economic crisis before, and this was health and economic, but when we look back at the crisis, the financial crisis of 2008, the public money, and this is important to realize, this is public money that's being pumped into the economy to revitalize it, wasn't conditioned on fulfilling any environmental criteria, wasn't really channeled into the green transition. And this is something which needs to be happening now. And I'm happy to see that this is happening to a very large extent in Europe. It's not perfect. I think there is still a lot of space for improvement, but I think the fundamental shift is happening. And there are two important principles here. One is to have a dedicated part of the spending. We managed to negotiate as a European Parliament 37% for climate, but also with the dedication for protection of biodiversity within the what's called Recovery and Resilience Facility. So the Corona Recovery Fund of the European Union. But also there is a conditionality on coherence level, because often what we see happening is that the governments give public money to greening, to environmental measures, and at the same time give public money to destruction of environment. And the Recovery and Resilience Facility has in its legislation a crucial thing, and that is the observation of do no significant harm principle. It's a principle that in EU was enshrined first time in the taxonomy regulation, which I had the honor of being the rapporteur for the Liberal Group Renew Europe, and is really about making sure that we are coherent in our policies and not undermining the environmental objectives with other activities. So this is the major shift that's happened, at least on the paper. Sadly, and that's also important, what we saw within the G7 countries is that, yes, there were big words about green recovery and need to really use the kind of coming out of the pandemic for the transformation to climate neutral and overly sustainable society living within the planetary boundaries. We saw that actually more money went to support of fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, than renewables. And I think this is something which is a really worrying sign that there is still enough willingness in a number of the G7 governments to prop up industries that need, I would say, more of, or to prop up activities that need to be phased out as soon as possible and replaced with sustainable solutions that help us to really avert the worst of the climate crisis. And I think this is going to be very important to watch also the G7 summit, where it's going to take this policy coherence, not only of the climate spending, but also of making sure that the rest of the money doesn't cause harm to environment very seriously. Because without that, we're just going to be throwing, again, public money, taxpayers' money out of the window and using it to harm the planet. Stephen, you are muted. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. As I should thank you, you kept to your time. Kathy, the same question. I go on to you. Thank you. You got the floor.
So I would say that the pandemic has impacted the climate change agenda. Sort of there's a couple of things to look at. I think on the one hand, it set us back a little bit, because for the last year and a half, all the focus has been very much on dealing with the pandemic, with the very immediate threat of the pandemic. And certainly here in Gibraltar, we've witnessed that in a very real way. Like, I still remember in January 2020, our chief minister was interviewed for TV, the New Year interview, and he said, you know, that his greatest challenge in 2020 would be dealing with the climate change emergency. And that was the focus. There had been a lot of momentum with the school strikes, people marching. There was a build-up, I think, of momentum about an understanding that this was an emergency that action needed to be taken much more quickly, that there's been, you know, we've had decades of talks and of promises, and that the time now was for action and implementation. And so it felt like we were on the cusp of something, and then the pandemic came, and I feel really threw a lot of that into disarray, because, you know, all resources, human, financial, emotional, were invested in dealing with this threat that came to us out of, well, not out of nowhere, but seemed, for a lot of people, it felt like it came from nowhere. We weren't expecting it, and it has diverted attention away. But I think, on the other hand, looking at it more positively, it does show how quickly actually the world can react to a threat when the threat is perceived to be real. So I think it's an opportunity to look at the ways that we dealt with COVID, I mean, to learn the lessons of COVID, and to take some of those lessons and some of those teachings and apply them to the climate crisis, in terms of cooperation, in terms of acting quickly and decisively, in terms of understanding that sometimes public money has to be spent on averting a crisis, on making decisions that are unpopular but that are for the greater good. These are all lessons, I think, that we've learned from COVID that can be done, that governments can take those decisions and businesses can do those things. And we just need to make sure that we don't slowly slip back into old ways of doing things and old habits, and we capitalize, as Martin says, on this opportunity to make sure that the money we invest is invested in a truly green recovery, rather than on, you know, sort of propping up businesses and industries that are no longer sustainable in a climate neutral world.
Yes, I am muted. I keep on being muted. Okay, now thank you, Kathy, for that. It's great to hear about how people are changing and how people can quickly adapt to. Njeri, you have the floor. Off you go. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you also to the speakers, including the chairperson of Libro International, who spoke earlier. And I'm very happy to be in this panel. So currently, of course, we know the world is mainly focused on the immediate health and economic and social impacts of the pandemic. And this gives a risk to the existing climate crisis being shelved. And especially in Africa, already climate change issues were not popular. They were not top of the game. So now when there's a health crisis and of a pandemic nature, it is very likely that they will shelve. And this also has been happening. We don't hear a lot of talk. The campaigners, the organizations that do a lot of campaign, like Greenpeace and others, do not have that space as they would have had before. And also, for instance, in Africa, climate change impacts have been causing a lot of disruptions to livelihoods and lives. I know this is all over the world, but in Africa specifically, livelihoods we do not have, because like I have friends from Europe who say that they are getting, I don't know what the term is, but some little funds that would help them move on, especially for the people in small businesses. But in Africa, that is not happening. So disruption of livelihoods and lives is very, very high. African communities need to mobilize resources for climate adaptation, but when do you mobilize? Do you mobilize for the pandemic, or do you mobilize for climate adaptation? So there's a chance that accessible funds for climate adaptation or action will be compromised as a result of significant funding going into the health sector. This will have implications on communities, how communities adapt to ongoing impacts, as well as extreme weather events. That will not be a priority anymore, and yet it is still going to continue happening because we don't have control over that. In addition, I think the pandemic has a dramatic rise in the use of single plastics materials, including masks and gloves. And like, for example, in Kenya, I come from Kenya, there was already a ban on plastics. But now, the masks are packed in plastic papers. There's a lot of gloves being used everywhere, including supermarkets. So there's an increase instead of a reduction. There's an increase of single-use plastics, which is very unfortunate. And this also includes plastic waste surges as restaurants struggle to keep up, and they're doing deliveries at homes. And when they do deliveries to homes, they're also, of course, packing things in plastics. Very rarely will you miss a plastic within the packages. And it's a good excuse for them to pack food that way, whereas they know there was already a ban before. So the proliferation of single-use plastics was already accelerating global climate, and we feel that the impacts of the pandemic will serve to intensify this pollution, and climate issues associated with the rise in use of single plastics is a bit unfortunate, especially for countries that had banned. All the East African countries, which are 5 countries, had banned plastics. And now, nobody's monitoring. There are excuses that, this cannot be packed without plastics. So there's a danger that we might roll back to situations that we had already gotten rid of. And let me stop there for now. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Njeri. That was pretty interesting. How some of them are going back to trying to, cover up what had been achieved before. Very interesting. And I'll go on to the second question to the panel, which is, how can we ensure that the pandemic recovery is green and respecting the principles of the Paris Agreement? I think Njeri already touched upon that a little bit, but I'll go on to Martin. Can you start on that one, please?
Thank you. Indeed, actually, I also mentioned it in the way that it's about the framework and the setup of the rules covering the spending, and also the reforms, because what we should not forget is that often the recovery packages, in the case in Europe, but I see it also in other parts of the world, that the recovery packages coming from the government and the union are not only about spending money, they are also about reforms. about new legislation to come up, which should help to facilitate the recovery. And that's besides ensuring that the money is spent right. And when I was mentioning the climate and environment spending and do no significant harm, this should indeed cover not just the climate, but I fully agree with the notion that this should also cover circular economics, because we have a massive problem with plastic waste. And let's not forget, plastic is essentially CO2 in disguise, because this is locked in fossil fuel to very, very large extent, because it's ultimately oil or gas-based plastic. So burning it means, again, more greenhouse gas emissions. So the transition to circular economy is very important part of the transition, and ensuring that we have it done without toxic chemicals. The change in the agriculture system is going to be very important, not only from the point of view of protection of biodiversity, not only from the point of view of protection of the livelihoods of people, especially in the developing countries. And what we see are the kind of the impacts of the monopolization in this respect, and the leftover of the smallholder farmers, but also in terms of the carbon capture in the soils. In this respect, I was spearheading the initiative in the European Parliament to create a European-wide legislative framework for soil, because soil is not only the treasure or trove of biodiversity, but also really the best carbon capture and storage technology there is in the world. And for that, we need to actually empower the farmers to use the techniques that will turn the farming land from the source of greenhouse gas emissions to a storage of greenhouse gas emissions. I think this is a really potent tool that we have at our disposal. So all the different reforms that are going to be coming out of the recovery packages need to be looked at and checked whether they are not undermining the effort on climate and environment protection, and where they are also supporting the innovation that can help to bring us forward, because there's a lot of what we can do on the front of innovation, while sadly what we see is still a lot of public money, as I said, going to support of fossil fuels. It's for me something else that, okay, a private investor decides to put their money into fossil fuels, regrettable, but something that it's their decision. But I think in this day and age, to see public money going for support of a fossil fuel, especially the infrastructure, it's a waste of money and ultimately stranded investment that we can ill afford.
Thank you, Martin. I'll ask the same question to you, Kathy. You've got the floor.
Thank you. So I think Martin's covered it really. It's about making sure that monies, public monies particularly, that are invested now going forward are conditioned to do no harm, so that every decision, every investment decision that a government takes is taken in light of the climate crisis. And the question is asked, does this help us to combat climate change, or does this contribute to the problem? And investment decisions that contribute to the problem should not be pursued. And I think we need to be looking at conditioning any bailouts to industries that traditionally have been polluting, and we're looking here at airlines. I think the tourism industry has been very heavily impacted by COVID, and there is an opportunity here to build a different type of tourism to make sure that travel is more sustainable. And I think that obviously will require finance, but I think it's finance that should come with conditions on environmental improvements. At a smaller scale, at a local level, if you're providing businesses with support because they've been heavily hit by the lack of tourism or the lack of trade, then that financial assistance should be conditioned on them making certain changes to their business model, to maybe installing some kind of renewable energy, to making energy savings. These are small ways in which we can all help to make sure that we're investing in a future that is sustainable. So and accepting, I think, also that some industries are just not sustainable, you know, in the future that we are looking to try to create, and to accept that those people need to have support that is not just financial support, but they need retraining. There needs to be investment in new industries and in new technologies, and we need to train people up to have those skills. So it's about reskilling people and making sure that we have the people within our society who are able to do the jobs that now need to be done, and not necessarily the jobs that were being done before. So it's an opportunity to reassess where we are and to make sure that that we are, you know, building back better. It becomes a bit of a cliche when you keep saying it, but it does very neatly encapsulate the concept, which is of trying to do things differently, of taking this crisis and seeing within it the opportunity to make big changes that you might not have made otherwise, because to challenge the status quo and to destabilize it in the way that COVID has destabilized it is not something that you would do under normal circumstances. So in these very extraordinary circumstances that we have been presented with, we have the opportunity to make bolder, I think, decisions and bigger leaps than we might have done otherwise. And we have to make sure we don't squander those opportunities, because they won't come back again that quickly.
Thank you, Kathy, for that. Very interesting. Njeri, now I'll move on to you with the second question. Unmute yourself, Njeri. Thank you.
Okay. I think the realities of the pandemic in relation to action on climate change are alarming, especially because the pandemic has taken over everything. The unfortunate reality, though, is that the long-term effects of climate change will be more disastrous than the impacts of the pandemic. So if we only look at the pandemic now and do not look at the impacts of climate change, we are shortchanging ourselves globally. And with the world's most vulnerable populations bearing the brunt of the effects, and we know, like for Africa, we have part of these most vulnerable populations here. Therefore, decisions made during and after the pandemic will be critical in determining whether it is possible for communities to recover and build resilience to projected future disruptions that may be caused by climate crisis. As communities invest in economic recovery, it is important that they invest in low carbon economic recovery activities, but governments have to assist in this, because otherwise, if this is an opportunity to recover and to have low carbon activities coming in and replacing the old ones, but communities cannot do it on their own. So we need to engage actors across the whole society with focus on ensuring that the most affected members of communities, particularly the marginalized and vulnerable groups, are centered in the recovery discussion. So it's not enough for governments to do this alone. They need to involve communities, and they need to discuss this jointly with communities, so that there is also an understanding as to why we are moving into the low carbon economic recovery rather than staying on the old and past systems that we had. Recovery options need also to be supported by scientific evidence, of course, on climate and biodiversity crisis. And this I leave to the scientists to be able to support also on this. But it will help to handle biodiversity loss and build resilience among communities, because let me just give an example. We've been working a lot with communities, the organization that I'm now working with, and we've been trying to scale up the leadership of these communities, so that they are prepared for future pandemics or for future crises, whatever crisis they can be affronted with. They can be able to deal with it, because majority of the people have never dealt with crises before. So we've taken advantage of the pandemic to prepare communities for any future crisis that comes. And I think climate change actors should take advantage of this as well, and really prepare communities towards those recovery processes for the future. Let me end there.
Thank you very much, Njeri. That was great. Right, we'll go on to the last question now for the three of you. We may say that the pandemic is a result of climate change. Many experts link the two. How do we ensure to maximize such shocks in the future? And how do we become more resilient when happening? Njeri just mentioned that at the very end, actually. So, Martin, you have the floor.
This is something, but for me, the causes of the, if I got it right, the question, the causes of the pandemic and their link to the climate change, I don't dare to kind of simply say such a straightforward link. For me, the causes are linked to overall the way to climate change and biodiversity destruction, not in a way that I would say it kind of it's a direct relation or direct causal relationship for the COVID pandemic. I think this is something which I always, coming from also scientific background, treat very sensitively. But it was very revealing when we had hearing with the scientists in the Environmental Committee of the European Parliament to hear the news from the Director General of the European Environmental Agency saying that, look, what the science says now is that we are in the age of pandemics. If you look at the occurrence of Ebola in Africa, it's increasing because we are encroaching the nature more and more. We can expect that we will see some of the tropical diseases moving north. We are disrupting the planetary ecosystems on a scale that it's only logical that, so to say, the nature will bite back. It's not any conscious move, but I think this is something which means that we have to really fight back, so to say, on both fronts. It's not only about lowering our impact, and ultimately what we have to achieve is living within the planetary boundaries that we have, but we have to also increase our resilience as a human society and really take a special care of in helping to increase this resilience of the most vulnerable groups, because it's about fairness. And indeed, it's hard to say that the people living in poverty are responsible, or would be responsible for the climate crisis. They're not. It's the people who consume most of the resources. Having said that, the planetary boundaries for me are a notion which maybe I think this is something which it's important to look closer within the Liberal International as a concept where if you would transform it into a debt of or kind of deficit of a state, or if you would look at it from perspective of the losses of a company, this is something which you wouldn't be able to afford. Yet on a planetary but also national scale, we're running on a massive debt. We as a planet, as a civilization, use up the resources of the planet by midsummer. And I don't think that there is a country which would be able to sustainably run on a more than 40% GDP budget deficit. In my own country, Slovakia, we are in the planetary debt since 13th of May, which would account 270% of structural deficit. And I think this is something which we have to look at, also the true value of the nature for ourselves and reflected in the economic models. And that's for me part of the learning also of the corona crisis, because one of the results is exactly such pandemic.
Thank you, Martin. I see that Hakima is very keen in coming in, but it's up to you, Hakima, whether you want to come in now, or
Yeah,
shall we allow Kathy and Njeri to just contribute on the last question, and then you can come in and finish off and wrap up if you want it. I think it's better. So, Kathy, you've got the floor again.
Okay, so I think one of the things that the COVID pandemic has shown us is that human health and planetary health are very much interlinked, and we need to look after both. We need to be thinking about both. And so I think when we are trying to think about how we want our societies to develop in the future, we need to be planning for health, health of the planet and health of the population. So we need to be thinking, and they are very much interlinked. So policies that will, for example, reduce air pollution. Air pollution was a big factor in how much COVID impacted upon people's health. So we're talking about cleaner energy, we're talking about cleaner transport, we're talking about more sustainable forms of mobility, so increasing people's exercise and physical activity, which in turn improves people's mental health, having more open spaces, protecting green areas, restoring ecosystems. And I think that it's sort of a dawning realization that this notion that, you know, you can tackle climate change, or you can tackle biodiversity, or you can tackle human health, it doesn't work that way. We have to be thinking about all of them all the time, because they are very interlinked. And when we fail to see those linkages is when we get caught off guard, you know, and a pandemic can come and decimate the way of life as we have always known it. And I think that the positive thing to take from COVID is to see how resilient actually people can be, you know, and to try and increase that resilience and that adaptive capacity to develop systems that can work even when the world around us isn't working in the way that we expect it to. So I think it's about that, looking at nature-based solutions. It's looking at living in harmony with the world rather than trying to impose our will upon it. And I think that really focusing on health is one of the ways in which we can increase that adaptive capacity, and that will help us to be both more resilient to any future pandemic, but also more resilient to the effects of climate change, because the steps that we take in order to improve our health will inevitably improve the planet's health as well.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And now go on to Njeri with the last question.
Thank you once again. I have three small points on this, and one is I think we need to embrace the concept of social capital, which has been created as people are trying to struggle and fight the pandemic in one way or the other. And there has been a sign, let me speak for the continent here, and also examples from Kenya specifically, interconnectedness and a shared sense of responsibility, which wasn't there before. So there's something new that has been created within the individuals and within the communities. And we need to kind of harness this before we lose it again. And here in Africa, we refer to it either as ujamaa or as ubuntu, something that people are more caring than they were before. People are more concerned than they were before. Yes, people are worried about their personal health, but there is a sense of a shared fear, shared worry, shared responsibility, and shared future. What is our future going to look like? And if there's a way that the world can harness this, and in Africa, if there's a way we can harness this so that we don't lose it, it will be very, very good. The other one is establishing robust early detecting and warning systems, which were not there for the pandemic before, and which also are not there even for climate change in this part of the world. So we need to have a sense of early warning, detecting in more areas than one. And if this pandemic can teach us something, it is that even in climate change and even in other areas, we need to forewarn ourselves as the world. We need to forewarn ourselves as a continent and even as countries, so that we have in place mechanisms to deal with these issues when they come up. And finally, Chair, robust information sharing platforms and forums, especially among communities, involving community members, we saw a very high need of working with communities at the lower level rather than working with governments, because we realize that if communities are not able to deal with the pandemic, then we will finish. We will die very, very fast, all of us. So if communities are able to deal with the pandemic in a responsible way, they start to deal with other issues in a responsible way, even in the future. So communication, using the platforms wisely, and harnessing what has been already created is very critical. And I want to end there, Chair. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, the three of you, for giving us a very plentiful answer to this. I pass now to Hakima, which I'm sure she can give us a lot on the three questions and all the comments that have been made. Hakima, I pass it on to you.
Stephen, I was very interested to listen to our speakers, and thank you all of you for your very interesting point. I want just to jump on what Martin was saying. Martin was saying that it's about policy change, and I completely agree with you. I was Minister of Environment, and I used to have to have meeting with the business and private sector who wants to green their industry. And for that, you need what you said, Martin. You said we need coherency. You can subsidize fossil fuel and ask for people to build a renewable installation. If there is no international coherency, and this is what Liberal International was calling for in COP23 and COP24 5 last year. We need this international coherency on international policies, and all the Paris Agreement is about a global transformation, and a global transformation means that we need to have a long-term visibility, we need to have a trajectory, and we need to have to subscribe to the right policies to provoke the change. And if your business people, if the investors have no visibility and have no clarity on the policies, they will not invest, they will not trust the government. And the second point I want to say, that the global transformation and the Paris Agreement implementation is not only a problem of public money, it's also our problem. It's private money, public money, all of us. Is a citizenship agenda where all the non-state actors, all the actors should subscribe to this strategy, to those policies, and implement the Paris Agreement. So we are changing everything. We are changing the way of consumption, we are changing the way of building, we are changing the way of lighting, we are changing the mode of transportation, etc., etc. So we are changing our industry and our production, and this need the right policies. So and coming back to what you said when you spoke about throwing the money out from the window, I agree. But until now, the only decision we need, there is always a balance between economy and environment. And if this balance is not set, the investors will not follow. Now we have demonstrated that renewable energy are by far more competitive than coal energy. So what we need political will, and we need a political decision to phase out coal installation, and we need to stop definitely investing in coal industry. It's not it's really not logical to promote climate change and COP26 and everything we want, and on the other side bring investment to coal industries in Africa or in China. So I think that This is the coherency you are speaking about. And the last point, which is very close to my heart, is the link between the pandemic, climate change, biodiversity, health, and economy. I was always saying that if we don't take it, and if we are not aware about the very, very close link between climate and biodiversity, between biodiversity and health, and between biodiversity, climate, nature, and economy, we will not live only the COVID-19 pandemic, but we will live many, many pandemic future in the future. So I think that we should not be surprised to have a pandemic when our biodiversity is at 80% at the risk to disappear. So we are threatening 80% of our biodiversity. And you know that the environment, the nature is balanced. There is a equilibrium in the ecosystem. So if you are not respecting the Mother Earth is not respecting you. So I'm not saying that COVID-19 origin is biodiversity origin, but I'm saying that there is a link, and we should recognize this link if we want to avoid and to anticipate in the future on other pandemic. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Hakima. That was very interesting. I mean, between the link between how people can react and how people have to take seriously all the elements that you've said, biodiversity, climate change, the temperature, economy, how we have to interlink them all for the planet, because ultimately we all have to live in a pandemic. And like Martin said, that we could even have more pandemics coming along our way if we're not careful. So this is a very interesting concept. We have a question from somebody who's put Jasmine Fratansi, and she's a member of parliament from Canada. And she is basically saying the developing countries are worst hit by climate change. And this is mainly due to what the other Western democracies are doing by heating up the planet. How do we reverse the impact, for example, of the arid lands in southern Sahara, because this is causing economic migration, and as Martin stated, other potential for more pandemics. What are the practical steps that can be taken? How many countries have not even met the Paris targets? And therefore, how can citizens take COP26 in Glasgow seriously? I'm going to start off with Martin to comment about what I've just read and give us a general comment, and then I'll go through to Kafi and then to Njeri, and I'll finish off with Hakima. Can you just give us a comment on what has been said here?
Thank you very much. Wanted to react to Hakima, but with few observations, but for the sake of time, I'll stick to the question. It was tempting, I have to admit. Yes, the responsibility lies with the, so to say, with the OECD members, essentially, and the G7 members, the richest economies of the world. We caused the pollution. And what we could actually start with, and it might sound ridiculous, but it's still happening. You would be shocked, but we still also support from public money build-up of fossil fuel infrastructure in the developing countries. The export credit agencies in the developing countries, in the rich countries, are still giving export credits for coal mines, fossil fuel infrastructure, something which it's not only about climate, it ultimately, given the developments of the energy efficiency and renewables, it's economically nonsense and will lead to stranded assets and more emissions. And I think this is where our first big job is, to make sure that we are assisting and helping to channel investment into developing countries, which will enable them to leapfrog, I worked for ActionAid for a while, and I remember being in Malawi, which is on one of the countries on the bottom of Human Development Index. And they had 3G mobile network and didn't have landlines because the government took a decision why we need to build up landlines when we can go straight mobile. And supporting a development of fossil-based energy infrastructure in the developing world would be equaling to building landlines in the age of 5G. It's actually depriving the peoples in the developing countries of their right for sustainable development and holding them back. And this is injustice. I think we need to really not just channel public money, but also create the condition of private investments. And here we're very correct. It's about setting up the conditions for the private investment, right? And for that, for example, the EU's taxonomy of sustainable investment is very, very important tool. Hopefully it's not going to be watered down in further process. There is a concern, but there is a generally huge appetite among the investors to go for sustainable investments, to make sure that the transition is just. We need to make sure that there is no greenwashing and there is no public support for those technologies which hold us back.
Yes.
Thank you, Martin. Kathy would like to comment on that?
Just to say really that I sympathize with the sentiment. It is difficult sometimes to watch these international conferences and to see the leaders talking, and time after time they meet and they talk and they make the big pledge, the big commitment, and then nothing changes. So I think that as citizens, it's time to let political leaders know that we need change, that we want change. And I think increasingly you see that businesses also want change, but they are looking, as Martin and Hakim have said, for direction, you know, for certainty that this is the way the world is going and that they're not going to be left out on a limb if they invest in the sustainable solution, in the green energy solution. So I think we need to look to our political leaders to make bold and courageous decisions, you know, that might not have seemed possible before, but I think that the pandemic has shown us that anything is possible and that we need to think big. You know, this is a big problem. We need to think big in terms of solutions. And I think that as citizens, we need to call for that change, and we need to call for it loudly. You know, we need to make it clear that we won't accept political leaders who don't commit to those changes. And as I think I said earlier, there has been a growing movement. I think Greta Thunberg has done wonders for creating awareness. But I think that there still needs to be more awareness. I think part of the reason why people accepted so many of the limitations that governments imposed upon us for COVID was because they understood that COVID was an immediate threat to them and to their health. I think for a lot of people, the link between climate change and their personal well-being is still a bit distant. They don't fully understand why they should care about a problem that is unlikely to affect them much in their lifetime, particularly in Western countries like in Gibraltar, in a fairly affluent nation where, you know, people think, oh, you know, that's in, you know, sometime in the future, and we need to try and make that present and convey that urgency to the people that we interact with on a daily basis, and to politicians and to higher levels, to people in business, to people who have the power to make the decisions that need to be changed. Because I think Hakima said it earlier, that it is time for implementation. This COP has to be about the things that we're actually going to do, not about setting targets for 10 years time, for 20 years time, for 30 years time. You know, targets aren't enough. We need the actual actions to go with them.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very interesting. Njeri?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you for the person who has asked the question. Indeed, it's a correct statement that communities and people in continents that did not contribute to climate change are the ones that are really receiving the brunt of it, and especially in Africa. And it's not just sub-Saharan Africa, I think it is most of Africa, really. And I just wanted to say that it goes beyond just climate change, but affects human rights of the people. because you find that the right to life is affected, the right to health is affected, the right to clean water is affected, the right to a lot of things that are related or damaged by climate change, and people then live a poorer life than they would normally live, even if they were poor financially, but they were still surviving because they had a healthy kind of life. But now they can't even enjoy that healthy life because of the challenges of climate change. So what I think is that, and of course, there is a lot of climate migration. We usually look at climate migration only maybe people moving from Africa to Europe or from moving from other continents to Europe, but there's climate migration within the continent. There's climate migration within semi-arid areas, within the country, to cities, to places just within. So populations are confused and displaced within their own comfort environment. So indeed, what that statement is correct. And what I think is that even at this G7 summit, really climate adaptation resources need to be put aside for the most vulnerable and for people in Africa and other continents that are suffering so much and did not contribute to this. So I think a sense of responsibility, I think the countries that have contributed the most should actually take responsibility and do something about it, rather than just looking at Europe or looking at the US or looking at other countries that can manage and mitigate. You see, climate change has no borders. It's one of those things that has really no borders. So if there's a way, and there should be a way, because where there's a will, there'll be a way. Climate adaptation is not going to happen in Africa without the support of the West, and the West is almost wholly responsible for the damage that we are having within the globe. So I would really appreciate further discussions on this, and we have been contributing even to the UN on the impact of human rights because of climate change. Now somebody talked about climate migration. All these are interrelated, and therefore we cannot look at one issue in isolation. We must look at all the issues as interconnected and then look for a solution based on that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very interesting. That's exactly what I think Hakima was saying before about them being interconnected. We've come to the end of this webinar. I just wanted to quickly wrap up, and if Hakima wants to wrap up as well, you can feel free to do so. I've just got one last comment that I wanted to put, rather than going through all the things that you have been saying. It's important that we look at, for example, the distribution of the vaccine. Why is it that only the Western world is able to vaccinate its population, whilst others in the developing world are still struggling to get it? That is an example of how us in the West have treated the developing countries. We have talked about investment. Martin talked about investment, and it would be silly to invest in developing countries producing fossil fuels. All these issues are the fact that we in the West have been the culprit of how the world is now. I think it's a quarter of the world consumes what the rest of the world consumes. I mean, we are the consumers. I think we need to look at consumption in general, and economics and consumption. I believe in the free market. Of course I do, an open free market, but it has to be now directed towards climate change and also obviously pandemic or any future pandemic that might come. So these are the things that I get from all of you, and it's been very interesting. It's great to see that at least we are focused. So we can see that, our minds are focused on what we need to do. Now, whether we actually, how we go about it, I can tell you that the Climate Justice Committee, we're working hard to see what we're going to do in COP26 to make the impact, have an impact on all these issues that we've been discussing here and many others that we will be discussing before we go there. So this is what I get from what we have had now, and all those who are watching the Facebook link, if you have any comments or whatever, we welcome you to comment in and tell us whether we are in the right direction or not right direction, or which direction should we take in these matters. Hakima, I just pass it on to you before I close down to give us a comment on all this, please.
Thank you, Stephen. I want just to say that remember that with the vaccine, in March already last year, we were calling on the World Health Organization to speed up the access to vaccine for the African countries, and we were asking for more solidarity and more international cooperation. And this is, I'm really astonished that until now, many African countries didn't have access to vaccine, even though we should not forget that many of the resources of the developed countries are in Africa. So even if all the people of Europe or outside Europe in the developed world are vaccinated, if the southern countries are not vaccinated, nobody will be healthy and economy cannot be launched again. So even not for, I would say, humanitarian issue, this access to vaccine is given to the Africans, it should be for economic reasons, because otherwise no economy will be launched. And we know that, and President Holland and President Macron said that the future of Europe is in Africa. We know that Africa is the reservoir of resources of Europe. So how can we not speed up the vaccines and the access to the vaccines for Africans? This is the first point. Second point, I will answer to our Canadian friend, the question of our Canadian friend. I think that there is, you are right, the southern countries and developing world are not responsible for climate change, and the developed world are responsible for the climate change. But this is something we end with during the Paris Agreement, and we are not opposing the North and the South anymore. What we want to build cooperation. Indeed, the South is suffering and was suffering well before even the Paris Agreement. Climate change is a reality in our continent, in Africa. Climate change is a reality. There is more than 600 million people who have no access to drinking water. Africa is a black point in terms of electricity and lighting. And if you look at the map of energy in the world, Africa is black. And it means that light is not only a problem, energy is not only a problem of lighting, it's a problem of development. You can't have build a health system if you don't have energy. You can't build industries if you don't have energy. You can't go to school if you don't have energy, and you can't have security if there is no light and there is no energy. So I think that the agenda of Light in Africa, bringing the social services to Africa is not only a developing agenda, but it's a peace agenda. And I completely agree with our friend Njeri when she said that when we are speaking about migration, we only speak about migration from the south to the north, but we forget that all the mega cities in Africa are receiving a huge amount of migrants each month because of the shortage of water, because of climate disasters, etc., etc. So I think that now it's the time, as Catherine said, to switch from speeches to actions, and as Martin says, to be more coherent in bringing coherent policies, international policies, coherent trade policies also, because we need now to build. And I always say to my African colleague, climate change is a really a climate opportunity, is a really a climate opportunity for our continent, because we are speaking about a continent where 75% of the infrastructure is not existing yet. So what we need, we can become the most resilient and most carbon neutral continent if we implement the right policies and if we implement the right technologies. So maybe climate change will be a climate chance for us.
Thank you, Hakima. That's just one last question somebody's posed, and they say there has been a diverse from fossil fuels and move to investment into greener energy. How do you think we can explain the importance of this when certain economies rely on coal, such as the western provinces of Canada? I think it's probably comes from Canada itself. This is an issue which I think also combines with, you know, as in we have said that we are trying to invest in, or companies try to invest in the developed countries by putting coal and other fossil fuels when they shouldn't. And it's also some of the countries in the West that are investing on fuels that they know that they shouldn't. And therefore, I just want a quick comment from all of you before we wrap up, if you want to, on this question. Anybody want to take it? Hakima? Yeah.
Martin.
Go on.
Thank you. The answer is called just transition. And that's what I think is different to what we saw 100 years ago. When 100 years ago the cars arrived, we changed, especially the Western society, changed from using horses to cars within approximately 10 years. It was a massive change. And I expect this change in the energy systems to be even faster, driven ultimately by market forces, less by the desire to protect the climate. And what is important from a policy perspective is to actually ensure that this transition is just. We have established a Just Transition Fund in Europe, and this is not to help the companies, but this is to ultimately help the regions and the people to come out, not with kind of having them on, so to say, the public paycheck, but reskilling, creating conditions for new businesses, and really helping the affected regions to transform, because otherwise we may face societal disruptions. And this is something which I believe we can prevent, and actually use this as an opportunity to support the green transition rather than a negative effect. We cannot leave people behind. That's very clear.
Kathy, just a last comment, please.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate it, it's about making sure no one gets left behind. So if an industry is deemed to no longer be sustainable and an alternative has to be found, the onus is on governments to make sure that the opportunities are available for people to reskill, to retrain, in order to be able to reinvest their energy and their workforce into industries that are sustainable.
Thank you. That's one of the things you mentioned before. Thanks. Njeri?
Yeah, this is a very interesting point, because already in Kenya and in Africa, a lot of investments are coming in, coal investments. And I just want to quickly, in like half a minute, just say that we had, there's a UNESCO heritage site in one of the most beautiful coastal areas in Kenya called Lamu. And the Chinese and some companies from Europe were trying to invest in coal there, big coal plants that was supposed to help the whole region, not just Kenya, but the whole of the Eastern African region. But there was a lot of resistance of the human rights and the environmental community in Kenya. And they went to court and they blocked, like it took 3 years, but finally the communities won against the government and against, because even the government was allowing this to happen. So the plant has been put off and canceled. And I know it's not all countries that will be able to resist in the way, because I know about the Kenyan civil society is very, very resilient and very strong. But not all countries may be able to do this. So I think there has to be an eye watching across the countries to see what is happening, because if there's no use China or England or another country saying we have reduced on coal, but what you're doing is actually bringing the coal to Africa to reinvest there. And Kenya is not a coal country. So there are other countries I know that is happening. And therefore there needs to be, we need to continue being watchdogs of climate change, of climate, and especially against coal or pro, let me say maybe not against, but pro renewable energy. So if we continue to push for renewable energy, and if people within their own countries are aware of this, then they will have the strength to resist when the coal initiatives come, even if they are coming with job creation and all other things that they put in the package. Over.
Thank you, Njeri. That was interesting. Hakima.
It's a very complicated question, but I will say 2 things. First, the Paris Agreement was talking about carbon neutrality, and it means that we will cohabitate together with fossil fuel and renewables. What is written on the Paris Agreement, and it was a long and very difficult negotiation, is that we are not going to phase out the fuel or to phase completely out the coal, but what we are aiming is to work towards a carbon neutrality where globally we reach the carbon neutrality. That means that we will have this cohabitation between fossil fuel energy and renewable energy. But I will fully agree with Martin when he said that the market, the force of the market, will definitely decide which source of energy will be sustainable. This is the first thing. And the second thing is what we said at the beginning of this meeting, is the coherency of the policies. If tomorrow we decide politically and we have the policies, we have the trade policies setting the rules of phasing out coals and stopping subsidizing fossil fuel, etc., we will create a real market where we can renewable energy can become very, very competitive. So I think that yes, we have to push, and I agree with Njeri when she said that it depends on the country, it depends on the civil society, it depends on the pressure civil society is doing, either to encourage or to stand against project. And I am coming from a region where civil society has shown that it was able to remove leaders from their seats. So I believe in the power of civil society and citizens. But definitely we will cohabitate together with fossil fuel energy. What we need the right international policies, coherent policies.
Okay, I think we can wrap up. We've got 1 minute to 6:30, which we've done pretty well to get up to the 1 hour and a half that we targeted. I just wanted to say that I think what we can take from here is one thing that Martin said, and that Njeri mentioned, and that Kathy also mentioned, and Hakima. I think it's a question of transition. It is a time that we need to push from, and Martin said, when people used to travel in the horse, to travel in the car. And then when we were traveling in the car, we used to use leaded petrol, and then we switched on to unleaded, and that was confusing because you didn't have petrol stations. Now we are moving to the electric, which is great. So cars and the companies and everybody's embracing electric cars. But I think it's also the change from the industrial revolution, where coal was the main energy, and that is where most of the ills now are happening in the world, of the world warming up, that we can transition from that type of energy from fossil fuel, black energy, to what is now sustainable energy, using things in the planet, the sun, the wind, the tides, and many other that we can mention, to transition the world into a healthier world. So thank you very much. This is obviously not going to be the last webinar we've had. It's been very interesting. I would like to thank you all. Thank Martin, Catherine, Njeri, and Hakima for being present here. But I would also like to mention Jason, who's not on, is at the back and doing all the IT work for us, and Andrea, who's been the leader of doing and getting all this together. Thank you very much, and I hope that we can have many more webinars like this one. Goodbye, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin.
Bye-bye.
Njeri, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Steven.
Thank you. Bye-bye.